his business, make arrangements for them to have those snakes there, and therefore he is able to continue with his business, but not affect the state of Nevada by having those in his possession. And so he may have some explanations for that, but I think that's something that I'm going to need to really understand, because I think, obviously from what we've heard, this is fraught with risk to bring it in, and I think about the issues that are going on in Florida with the snakes that they have down there. Having non-indigenous snakes released, and the impacts it's had on wildlife there. It's a tragic situation, and anyway, that's something that I've got a big question on.
Any other commissioners have any comments? Okay, seeing none, does the department have any more? All right, seeing none, before we bring you back up, Mr. Potash, I'm going to take it to public comment. That way you can address all the public comment, all the commission comment, the department comments at one time. So any public comment on this at this time? Okay, Sean, come on up.
Sean Shea, Washoe County. We read this, and like I said, we didn't have anybody there to ask questions, and that's why we denied it. So I just wanted to make that clear. We had a lot of questions and nobody to answer. So
okay. Anybody else? Okay, seeing none, I'll bring it back to. Well, come on up, Mr. Potash, and then we can probably ask questions of the commissioner. You can address what you've heard.
Okay. Yeah, really quick about the Washoe County meeting. Again, I'm sorry I didn't make it that meeting. Had I known about it, I absolutely would have been there to answer those questions. A few of the notes that I'd written down here regarding the State Board of Agriculture, I did actually put that in the petition that there would need to be a change to NAC 571 regarding the importation, simply changing it to state that there shall be no importation without prior approval by the department. I wasn't aware that I need to go before a different board for that, so that is definitely something I would be willing to do. Washoe County Animal Control right now is kind of in a state of influx. They have proposed some new changes to the regulations, and a group of us have been trying to work with them to make some changes. Currently, I have been grandfathered by the Washoe County ever since their interlocal agreement with Sparks in Reno, since I had permits in Sparks beforehand. I'm sure that would change after they enact new ordinances, and that's not a problem. We're trying to work with them on caging standards, and of course, the permit process for venomous reptiles and such. As Paul stated, a lot of their regulations on that stem from the NRS and NACs. They kind of mirror those. So yeah, I'm already kind of working with them on trying to come up with variances for this. City of Sparks zoning is something I will definitely have to look into. As I understood, the City of Sparks and Reno, in their interlocal agreement with animal control, essentially put Washoe County in control of any animal issues. But the zoning might be something else I have to look into in Reno and Sparks. The investigation form that Paul discussed is something I would definitely be able and willing to do. In fact, that's something I've kind of been curious about for a while, because a lot of the prohibited species listed in NAC are specifically listed as being an ecological threat should they be released or escape, whereas the venomous reptiles are just kind of all lumped together. If it's not found in Nevada, you can't have it. There is a wide variety of those snakes that definitely would not pose an ecological threat, because just their habits and where they live, there's no way they could survive in the state of Nevada. A couple possible exceptions to that I would be interested in would be maybe like a prairie rattlesnake and a northern Pacific rattlesnake. Those are about the only ones that could potentially live here. However, prairie rattlesnakes are very close to here and have never ranged into Nevada on their own with no land, no barriers, basically. So whether or not they could survive here is questionable. Obviously, if I'm to have the snakes devenomized, there would be no chance for their survival anyways. There was discussion about breeding. Of course, as I said, I have no intent to breed. When I transport the snakes, I transport them individually in venom buckets that have screw-on lids, and they're housed and caged individually as well. Let's see. There was the discussion of quarantine measures. Generally, when I bring a new snake into a collection, I quarantine it for a minimum of 60 to 90 days anyways in a separate part of the house where it's not in any contact with any other snakes. I don't use any equipment transferring back and forth, and I often will change my clothes too, going in between the different rooms. I would definitely be looking, though, to buy long-term captive or captive-born animals. I would not have a lot of interest in taking an animal out of the wild and having it sent to me or going and catching it myself, simply because wild animals are unpredictable whether or not they're going to feed or do well for you. So I think that would address a lot of the concerns regarding any disease transmission, and as of course about the fungal issues, as you can see that those are mainly issues that affect animals that live in more humid environments, which obviously Nevada is not. Let's see. Oh, and there is actually, when you brought up the concern of other people being able to come into Nevada to do the training, that's true. If they do come to Nevada, there's no need for those non-indigenous snakes. However, there's another rule, I believe it's still under 503.110, that allows a person possession through the state as well. So anybody possessing a prohibited species traveling through the state in less than 48 hours, there's no permits or process for that as well. And some of the species of snakes, things like timbers and easterns, were just things I'd mentioned as a possible interest. Right now that wouldn't be my interest because we're not doing anything in their range. However, things like copperheads and cottonmouths would be. And as far as the rabies concerned, this is actually a question I don't know if the doctor would have an answer to, but is it okay to address a question to her, or how does the process work?
What's that?
The question I would have is, what are the chances of a captive-born skunk from a breeder who has had multi-generations of skunks? What are the odds or chances that that animal could possibly even carry the rabies infection?
Dr. Wolf?
Probably Dr. Wolf for the record, certainly if the animal was captive born, the chances of it, if it had been in a closed facility its entire life, probably the chances of it would be fairly slim that it would have it. The issue is that, once if that animal is traveling or is exposed in any other way, if it stays kind of in a quarantine situation, that's fine. But if it ever travels outside of the state, and then you don't know. I mean, we have no way. Is that animal be acting strange because it has rabies, or is it acting strange because it's sick for some other reason? So yes, potentially the risk could be low, but it's an unknown in these skunk species, and we have no way. Some of these animals will harbor rabies for years and years without showing clinical signs. It's just never. No one's ever put the money into taking every species that could get rabies and say, okay, we infect it. Now how long before it potentially shows clinical signs? There's no money in doing that. So therein lies the risk, is that we just don't know in some of these wildlife species, and it just presents a risk, especially if that animal is outside or traveling back and forth between different states. Is that?
In an attempt to address that issue, if this were to go through, we would definitely try to, work with people on protocols for transportation. Essentially, when we do the training session, our intent is to use 2 skunks per training course. One would be on a harness, on a leash, held by a person at all times, and the other would be inside of a double cage, one inside the other, to create a barrier so that the dog could approach the cage, smell it, without having any chance of physical contact. And then, of course, it would be transported, put straight into transport containers from there. So I think that would greatly minimize any risk. However, we would definitely be willing to work with the authorities on establishing some kind of guidelines or protocols on that. And I believe that was about it.
Commissioner Macbeth, and then we'll go to Commissioner Young.
Mr. Potash, I didn't get an answer to my question, so
Yes.
maybe did you understand what my concern was? And I hadn't heard an explanation why you could not use either
Right.
skunks or snakes that are indigenous to the place where you're going to do the training and obtain those species from the local people there on a loan basis or some other arrangement so you can do the training. I need to kind of see what your thoughts are on that.
Oh, okay, absolutely. In fact, we've actually done that in Northern California. We have worked with a couple people I know, the Sonoma County Reptile Rescue and such, to borrow snakes from them for training in Northern California. However, unfortunately, my network doesn't really expand very far beyond that. My concerns would be finding people, for one, who have the animals, and if they would be allowed to legally do that under their current state permits. And then, of course, the issue with the devenomized snakes. That's kind of a contentious subject in reptile circles. A lot of herpetologists don't believe that you should devenomize a snake. They believe that altering it is just not natural for the animal. However, I have 4 devenomized snakes now that I've had all for over 10 years, and they're doing perfectly well. So, and I do have a veterinarian in Southern California who does perform that surgery. So that would just be my concerns. Absolutely, if I could find somebody to do that in an area, I would prefer to do it. It would make travel a heck of a lot easier. But I just don't. I'm not so sure that I would always be able to find somebody if their permits would allow them to do that. And then, of course, the devenomized snake issue.
Commissioner Young?
Just a couple more questions and then maybe a statement. Obviously, I'd like to see your business. I'm always pro-business if we can do it, but the science doesn't seem to be on your side yet, and it seems to be kind of an emerging business or idea. A couple questions. Do you have a degree in herpetology?
I do not. I've been studying it for a long time, but I do not have a degree.
Is there a professional licensing organization for what you do, or herpetologists, or this type of training? In other words, is there a body that you have to be licensed by that can regulate you or your profession and limit you or fine you or put you out of business if you violated any state law or local law concerning training?
Actually, no, there is no overseeing type of organization for this type of business. This type of business is, you're right, it is fairly new and emerging. I think it's been going on for probably well over 20 years, but it just hasn't really taken on. It seems to be a lot more now. Every time I do an internet search, I'm always finding somebody new taking on. Essentially, I think we're just regulated by local and state laws regarding the animals, the handling, the caging, keeping, housing, and so forth. And there's really no overseeing organization on the dog training aspect either. I think that's just more or less finding somebody experienced that is like an animal behavioralist or something.
Sounds like to me to
those
make
lines.
this to work, you're either going to have to do like Commissioner Macbeth suggested, or, in my opinion, work with Dr. Wolf and make her happy.
Oh, yeah,
if
and I'm
that's
absolutely
possible
willing to.
To do that, you know, and with this biological information that she presented. So thanks a lot for your presentation. It's very
Thank
good.
you.
Nobody? Okay. I think we're done with you, and now
Thank
we'll
you very
bring it back
much.
to the commission and have some discussion amongst ourselves. Anybody want to start? Commissioner Lane?
I'm still going to go back to my original issue, and unlike Bill, I'm not always convinced that all businesses are good. I don't like the idea that,
Excuse me, I didn't say they were all good, Karen. I said I'm pro-business.
okay, well,
Okay,
I mean, I
there's
guess what I'm...
businesses that I don't agree with. In fact, I spent my lifetime trying to put a lot of them out of business in Las Vegas, as you know.
Thank you, Commissioner Young. I appreciate the, but I guess what I'm suggesting is that I think we really need to take a look at some of the impacts at the local level in terms of what the business may entail and some of the issues. And I'll also say I have some concerns from a humane aspect, but those aren't my primary concerns right now. I have some, I guess my biggest issue is that you are really going to impact the local animal control services in terms of what's being proposed here. And I will say from, in terms of looking at disease vectors, I am extremely concerned by some of the things that have been presented by Dr. Wolf, and I personally don't want to go there.
Anybody else? Okay, it is a petition. It doesn't say we agree with it or don't agree with it. If we vote to accept the petition, at that point, the department has to start the regulation process, and it comes back again to be heard and finalized. Any thoughts on that? Because we would only be accepting a petition, but as we've done in the past, if we don't think it's going to pass the second time it comes in front of us, it's kind of a waste of time of the petitioner and of the department staff time to draft up regulation, send it through LCB, jump through all the hoops we have to then deny it down the road. So, Commissioner Young?
It's pretty clear from what you just said, Jack, that it'd be the case, so I'd agree with that thought. You know, the rest of the commission stands is, you know, the time impact on a department, which is precious.
Yes.
I've come to learn, very precious. They're understaffed and underfunded, so I'd say no.
Okay, any other comments? Does anybody have a motion?
Since I've been a big mouth, I'll make a motion to deny the petition at this time, as presented.
Second.
We have a motion by Commissioner Young, second by Commissioner Drew. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion passed unanimous. Thank you for your time today. Okay, we're going to move on to agenda item number 8, fiscal year 2016-17 NDOW Biienniiall Budgett. Pattrriick Cattes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I passed out earlier a one-page sheet highlight of our budget enhancement units. We're bringing this before you, I think, for the third time with our budget concepts. The director is responsible under statute for submitting budgets to the governor's office for consideration by the governor. Those budgets will be submitted 2 weeks from today. We have decision units drafted and some costs estimated. We're still working and refining those numbers. So we have a little bit more detail for you. I'll highlight some of the changes and some of the detail that maybe we haven't discussed before. Our top priority is urban wildlife management. This decision unit, when we talked about it before, was focused solely on bears in the Tahoe Basin. It was Commissioner Lane who brought up several times the importance of need statewide, in particular with the coyote problem in southern Nevada. So we have listened to that, and we've made this request more robust and broader than originally intended. It's intended to address all urban wildlife issues with a heavy emphasis on bears in northwestern Nevada and coyotes in southern Nevada. The types of things that we would do for coyotes would be similar for bears. We would have public service announcements, some documentaries, informational things to give to people so they know how to deal with either bears or coyotes in the urban interface. One of the things that we changed and added to this decision unit are 2 seasonal positions, conservation aides, to be housed in the eastern and western region offices. Their primary duty would be taking nuisance wildlife calls and providing information to the public. They could potentially on occasion respond, but the main purpose is for them to direct people to resources and, of course, dispatch appropriate people, game wardens, as it may be, if there's a true public safety threat. We don't have a position for Southern Nevada. We're still talking about that. Southern Nevada has an administrative aide in the law enforcement division that currently takes those calls. So we're evaluating whether we have the existing resources to handle that or whether we need to beef that up. So we may or may not look at a 3rd seasonal for Southern Nevada before we submit this. I wanted to point out the funding to you. The total request for the biennium is $632,000 of state general fund. As I've talked about in the past, urban wildlife, nuisance wildlife issues have traditionally been funded by the state through the state general fund, and we lost those several years ago, and we're eager to get those back. You see an offset, a savings of sportsman fees of $170,000. That represents existing NDOW staff time dealing with nuisance wildlife. Carl Lackey codes his time to that, for instance. Game wardens in the western region code time to that. We do know that it is an underreported code. If a staff person doesn't spend a lot of time dealing with nuisance wildlife, they're often not using this code. So I think it's a pretty underreported number. When we were funded with general fund, we were very meticulous about coding to this. And since that funding went away and it's been paid for with regular sportsman dollars, I think people that weren't heavily involved in urban wildlife issues didn't code to it. But that's the most we can justify with our numbers that we have, and we're going to explain that to the legislature. And it may be, if once we get people coding properly to it, that there could be even more existing staff time that's really being spent on nuisance wildlife. In fact, I know there is. We have a staff-level biologist that spends a lot of time dealing with nuisance wildlife, and he just found out about the code when we were developing this decision unit. So the reporting is something we have to improve. I think it's a real underestimate of what the current staffing resources and sportsman dollars are paying for this. It has the elements that it had before. It has some supplies for the urban bear program, purchase of another Karelian bear dog to be assigned to one of our game wardens. It also includes a stipend to whoever has the dog for allowance for costs of feeding and veterinary care, that sort of thing, because it would be a department's animal resource and assigned to them in the same manner that a police dog may be assigned to a police officer in a metro police department. So that is the biggest change from what you've seen before. The other items I'll just briefly touch on. Some of the terminology we've changed as we try to get a little more marketable names for these things, but mobile and Web 2.0 customer service. This one's pretty simple. Most of the funds being requested here are to have programming changes done by SCI to both the consumer site for license sales as well as the application hunt site to make modifications to facilitate use of mobile devices, so somebody could sign up for a tag, go through the application process on their phone, which I suppose you could do, but it's not really designed for a phone. It's not very practical. It also would include downloading of a license from the consumer site to your phone. You can currently download a PDF, but it's a large file and it's really designed for a desktop, not a phone. So it would make those changes. It would also provide some training for our current webmaster. We're already in the process of making our website mobile-friendly, but this would give them some enhanced tools to more robustly use that website, as well as some enhanced tools to track our communication metrics. You know, we have email blasts, we update Facebook, we update Twitter, we do all these things. We have people coming to our website, and they each have all different kinds of analytics and metrics to figure out how well you're getting your message out and how to target your audience. And this tool will help us analyze those across all those platforms. The next item is the scientific database. We've talked about this before as well. This is focused specifically on a big game database. What we have proposed here is a contract with a consultant to evaluate and design a database for us, evaluate what we have. Currently, we have most of these records in paper and various formats all around the state. We're actually making progress right now combining them together. But what we're looking for is more than just a database. We're looking something that, you know, where people can mobily upload their data. When biologists are out doing surveys, they could upload their data. And there's a lot of pieces to that, and we don't think we have any one person in-house that can do that, so a consultant would really help us design what that needs to look like. Next item is headquarter move and lease. This would move headquarters staff out of Valley Road. It would retain Valley Road as a western region. We would make no changes to Valley Road at all in terms of modification to the building, which we had considered. The ongoing costs for this are about $230,000. I want to per year. That's a lease expense, an estimate for lease expense. Obviously, we don't have a specific site identified yet. I wanted to speak a little bit about the funding for this, sportsman fees. Leasing of office space becomes part of our indirect cost rate. So we cost charge that to our grants and we get reimbursed. We basically get about half our cost back through federal grants through indirect cost charges. But we have to incur the cost first. It becomes part of a base year cost, and then it becomes part of an indirect rate in a future year. So initially this would be paid for with sportsman fees, but it would be recouped in future years through indirect cost charges, at least a portion of it. And ongoing, the lease expense, that would be a full indirect cost charge year after year. The next item is administrative support staffing. This is a request for 2 management analyst positions in the fiscal services section. Their duties would include contract management, sub-grant management, federal grant draws, cost accounting, and indirect cost calculations, as well as non-executive budget administration. The reason we're asking for this, asking for these positions is there's several reasons. We have had some audit findings, particularly about contract management, how well we manage our contracts. We have a very large volume of contracts. The person who is managing them is also the manager of our accounts payable. Just to give you an idea of volume, she came from Department of Ag. They had about 150 active contracts. We have over 500. And that actually has gone down because we also use subgrants. And we just started doing that fairly recently, and that is very contract-like, and it takes a lot of time to do it. We currently have a management analyst doing the sub-grant function, as well as some of these other functions, the non-executive budget administration, and it really has pulled them away from what they were intended to do, which was to assist the division administrators with budget tracking and forecasting and monitoring their budgets. Part of this is brought about by the budget reorganization that we did a few years ago, where we went from one massive administrative budget to several budgets, one for each budget division. The purpose of that was to improve the transparency of our books. It did that, but it also created a lot more complexity in our accounting systems. And so this will help us shore up the staffing needs to manage that system and do a better job. The next item is professional development. This is a pot of money for professional training for NDOW staff, specifically for succession planning. We have seen a lot of turnover in positions, particularly in management positions. We expect more of those to be coming soon. A very large percentage of our workforce is eligible to retire. Deputy Director Rich Haskins, his last day was yesterday. And this will help us give the tools to the next generation of management coming through the ranks to be able to do their job more effectively. Spanish translation and outreach. We've talked about this before. What we have this focused on at this point is bilingual signage for fisheries statewide. So basically we're buying bilingual signs and fence posts and going to install them. It would take a few years. If I remember correctly, I think it was a couple bienniums before we would replace all signage statewide, but this will allow us to make progress towards that. As well as Spanish radio public service announcements. It would include the design of the PSAs, translating them into Spanish and having them run on Spanish language radio in the Reno and Vegas markets. And then the last item is the videography contract for wildlife education and public outreach. It's a variety of format videos. They're all fairly small. Some of them are very short videos, a minute or two, that are designed to be able to put on the web or our website, on our Facebook page, that sort of thing. Things that we can send people in short little clips and bits, and because we live in that digital age where a lot of people, particularly younger people, consume a lot of information that way. For instance, we had the wild sheep that were taken to Utah. They had a big release. Well, Utah has a videographer. They did this fabulous video. It's really good PR. Really lets people see, how sportsman dollars are being used, and it really captivates people. And we don't have those resources, so this gives us some money to do a better job there. And that's it. Questions?
I think we talked about this before, but the issue of there's no additional law enforcement, and I think the discussion was that at the time there were a lot of vacancies, and those were just now being filled. In other words, you had a lot of vacancies in the law enforcement complement portion, and you wanted to wait and see how things went once all those were filled. Is that correct? And that's why there are no additional law enforcement positions being requested at this time?
Well, we do have a lot of vacancies. I don't know that we saw the need to add more law enforcement resources specific to this. We think it's more of a matter of education, of giving people a resource that they can talk to short of law enforcement, because a lot of times the issues can be dealt with that way. That's kind of how we looked at it.
To follow up Karen's question, Pat, could you tell me what your authorized strength in law enforcement has been or is, and what we actually have today? Because I've heard anecdotal information in the last year or two about how short we are on actual law enforcement wardens in the field and the territory that they have to cover. And of course, in my background, I am very concerned about that. And I do agree with you that education has got to be, but there's a balance there. And I just like to know what we have. And
yeah, Commissioner Young, if I might, just speaking to the agency as a whole, and having 7 different divisions and looking at our agency budget and where our resources go. So currently, when we look at our resources, by division, law enforcement is hands down our single largest division. It comprises approximately 25% of the state's budget, utilizes approximately 33% of all of our tag and license sales. So when we look at adding law enforcement, certainly, we wouldn't argue that, we have needs, but we have needs across the board. And it's, whether it's fire, law enforcement, I think what you have to do, there will never be enough fire stations to prevent every fire. There will never be enough wardens to prevent every wildlife crime. And the question is, where do we reach that balance where we have an adequate presence in the field to encourage voluntary compliance that doesn't come at the expense to the agency or the sportsman's dollars to be able to effectively manage the other species that we have the statutory responsibility to manage, especially when given that those law enforcement expenditures, whether it be vehicles, other equipment, or salary, are 100% sportsman's dollars, while we can leverage 3-to-1 most of the biologist positions. So it's a balancing act, and presently we do have 8 vacancies in law enforcement, and that hurts. But I don't know that it's fiscally sound to add positions with the anticipation that there will always be some vacant. So the hope is that we can fill those vacancies, maintain a full force, and realize that we are overwhelmed with the area. I mean, Nevada and the Nevada Department of Wildlife are unique amongst Western wildlife agencies in that we are very small. We are incredibly small. We have limited resources. So even though we have, excuse me, 1/3 the deer that Utah has, or 1/5 the deer Colorado have, we still have the same area. So we have significantly fewer funds and significantly fewer deer to fund those activities, but we have the same geographic area. So we're trying to strike a balance, and we acknowledge that it would be great to have a greater law enforcement presence, but we have to ask ourselves at what expense.
I totally get that, Tony, but how many wardens do we actually have, or law enforcement positions?
I believe there's 41, but the field wardens, there are 32 field wardens. 40 some odd if you include supervisors.
And just for anecdotal information, how many are assigned permanently in Clark County that are actually working and living in Clark County?
Many of those positions are boating safety positions. A lot of them, I can't give you an exact number.
And I know we've lost, we've certainly seen a decline in boating.
I would say half, a third.
I'm just,
I'm not sure the exact
sorry about these questions, but I'm concerned about safety of the officers, visible presence, just myriad of things that cross my mind from my experience in my business.
Well, and back to the focus on the urban wildlife management, we didn't look at that as needing more officers to address that. These are metro areas. There's a multitude of law enforcement. We're often not the first ones there dealing with it. We work closely with the local sheriff's office, and so we saw more of a need of dealing with the calls coming in to direct people to use the law enforcement resources we have more efficiently.
Commissioner Lane?
Well, and I think with that respect, maybe I think that's what we're both trying to look at, where you talk about up under urban wildlife management. You've indicated that you're adding to the western and the eastern regions, and you've got a position that you're looking at. You haven't added anyone in the southern region, but you've got a position that you're looking at. And I guess my concern is that somehow or the other, we need to address some of the issues that we're seeing down there. And I do agree with you. I think a lot of this is education. I think Chairman Robb said the other day, we have lions in our community. Nobody says anything about the lions. It's not unusual to see a mountain lion. So I think part of this, a lot of this is an educational effort in terms of understanding what you need to be, what that citizen needs to be concerned about. So I think that's probably critically important, and I just hope that we try to address those issues. I just want to make sure, whether we do it by education or by law enforcement, that we do try to address some of the issues that we're seeing down there.
Yeah, Commissioner Lane, just a couple thoughts on that. When we say we're talking about adding positions in the western region and eastern region, that's with the hope that we could provide those other regions with the same resources that already exist in the southern region, because we have an individual that has those specific responsibilities already in the southern region. And when we have those positions, what those do is they enable law enforcement to do their jobs as they would prefer, frees them up from running around and looking for an injured deer or a coyote in somebody's yard. They can actually go out on patrol. But by having those positions, the salary is significantly lower than a full-time law enforcement officer. So it allows us to not only free up the time for the warden, but then to more efficiently spend that money. So when Mr. Cates said that we're looking at a position in the South, we're looking at an existing position that already filters calls, that already has a hotline set up for people to call in. That's part of the issue. The other part of the issue is that I understand, from our staff, from you, from these meetings, that there's a significant issue in the southern region with coyotes. This request is a general fund request because, again, we lost that general fund to do these activities, and so essentially sportsmen are subsidizing nuisance wildlife activities. We still have the statutory responsibility, but it puts us in a very difficult situation to take tag and license sales to hire law enforcement at a higher salary rate to go deal with these nuisance wildlife issues where there isn't a simple solution. Arguably, there isn't an effective long-term solution. There's expensive short-term solution that is usually just engaging in conversation with folks. But we feel that with a strategy that involves conservation education and individuals who aren't necessarily law enforcement officials to answer phone calls, provide a filter, and provide resources to these individuals, we can more effectively address it short-term and long-term and more cost-effectively.
And Tony, I agree with you and understand what you're saying. I just, from the law enforcement perspective, I was born here in this town, lived here till I was 9 years old, and moved to Las Vegas, and had basically grown up in Clark County, but always had to hunt north, really. And you don't see the rangers or from the federal level or the law enforcement component in the Nevada Department of Wildlife in the field like we did 20 years ago. And that's just my honest opinion. I can tell you, you just don't see them. They don't visit your camps as often. I know they're understaffed. I know your budget issues. I went to Wyoming to hunt elk this past season, and there was a warden came by, or 2 or 3 every day to our camp, and visited and checked us out and all that. And I know they've got a plentiful of wildlife and probably make quite a bit of money from their licensing fees. But I think we do need to look at some alternatives and think outside the box a little bit, using local law enforcement, perhaps a little bit more cross-training to do some of this work, reserve program with retired law enforcement officers. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to actually write a citation in the field for something or double up in a unit that would just have one law enforcement specialist, and having another trained person in the vehicle with them certainly enhances their ability to be out in the field, in my opinion. So I just hope that you do look at some of those things and expand that, because I truly think that a lot of the people that I know that hunt and fish and are outdoors, and I'll be first to admit, I'm not saying most of my friends are law enforcement people, but a lot of them are, and they all see this, and it's something that I know we do need to look at, and I know you got a tough job balancing all this. So,
Anybody else? Commissioner McNinch.
So Patrick, the urban wildlife management enhancements, I know that general fund dollars are a real steal for the Department of Wildlife. Anytime you can get some, it's a big deal, because it's the purse strings are pretty tight. So did any of these enhancements with the urban wildlife stuff, do they affect the wildlife diversity request or appropriations request at all?
What they currently have? No.
Going into the next year, into
Right.
this fiscal?
Well, we currently have in our base budget a little less than $500,000. Sorry, my throat's killing me this morning. That will remain in the budget. That funds wildlife diversity and endangered species programs under fisheries. Sorry.
Tough question.
That's part of our base budget. That's not going to go away. That doesn't have any impact on this. Some of this money is for wildlife diversity.
No, right. I just wanted to ask the
Exactly.
question, and then I wanted to just make the statement. I think it's a great idea to, I think it's a great way to go here that, that you're putting that, putting some of these urban wildlife management issues and trying to get them back onto the general fund and get away from the sportsman's dollars going into them. I think it sends a real strong message that, and after this WAFA meeting, which we'll talk about in a little while, things are headed that way, and I think it sends a real strong message that wildlife's not just about sportsmen paying for it anymore. That there's responsibility just from a general public, just from being a citizen. That in any state, you've got some responsibilities. If you're going to have issues with wildlife, you should pay for them. And if you're going to make the phone call, you ought to be willing to chip in a little bit here and there. So I don't know. I think this is a real strong statement, and I think it's a great way to go to alleviate some of that pressure off of those dollars, and I think it sends a strong message.
Anybody else? I'm looking down lower at item number 7, and Spanish translation and outreach. My biggest concern on this is if we do get it translated, how often does it get updated? Because we're finding that a lot of our stuff in English isn't always updated and causes confusion, keeping track of it in English, let alone in Spanish. And if you translate it once, does the translation come across accurately? And when it's updated in English, does that get updated in Spanish? And just in the past few weeks, we've had instances where Muley Crazy blows up because there's question on the Silver State tag and what the website says, and it says it right in one place, doesn't say it right in another place, so there's confusion among our hunting public. When we drove down to Tonopah to go to a commission meeting, Walker Lake has a fantastic sign that tells a good story about Walker Lake, but it's outdated because we don't have fish there anymore. It's talking about their reintroduction of Lahontan cutthroat trout into Walker Lake, and it tells its success. It shows Creole census and everything. And then a faded piece of paper 15 feet away from it says, oh, they're all dead. I mean, that is a concern of mine. It's not keeping up in Spanish, it's keeping up in English. And those are just two things that have come up in the past few weeks. If we went looking through the website, or if we went looking through current literature out there, how much of this stuff that could possibly be translated not actually be pertinent to what's going on right now? Those are some of my concerns with the translation issue. Is I think we need to catch up in English before we start looking at Spanish.
If I could respond to that, this is focused specifically on signage for fisheries statewide, so minimal signage about regulations, license, catch limits. I'm not sure what all the signs are. They would be bilingual, and our fisheries people recognize that a lot of the existing signs are out of date and in disrepair. So it would be simply focused on that. It's not translating all of our material. In fact, we even toyed with the idea of, translating our fishing guide and our hunt guide, and we decided that was just too much. So we're just talking about signage, and we're talking about public service announcements directed at the Spanish-speaking community. That we work with Bowserman Group. They would design the PSAs, they would script them, and we would have them translated into Spanish because they don't have translators on staff. The state has a translation service that they use. So the translations that we're talking about here are directed specifically at designing PSAs for the Spanish language radio market and for the signage strictly for fisheries, which should be pretty limited. I mean, they don't say a whole lot on those signs.
All right. I just, I see translation and I just go, boy, I don't know if we're caught up in English yet, so I just want to strive that we need to catch up.
Good point.
Anybody else have any questions or comments? This is listed as an action item. Do we have any public comment, or do you have anything else to add before we move on, Deputy Director Cates?
Nothing to move on. As far as the action item itself, under statute, the director consults with the commission in preparing the budget. Totally up to you what action you want to take. You could take no action, vote in support of all of this or some of it, or whatever you want to do.
Okay, thank you. Come on up, Elaine.
Elaine Carrick-Reno. Two questions, and I'm not sure if my questions fit into this budget for draft enhancements, but maybe someone could answer that question. I've heard in the past that these meetings may be going to video conferencing, and that would really be, I think, a benefit to the public. Rather than having to fly down to Las Vegas, driving to Fallon and going to different places. I didn't see anything in the budget that has to do with the progress of video conferencing these, and so I was curious about that. Then my second question, which is totally different, it really has to do with polling and of the public. I know in one of our meetings in the Bear Committee, we talked about getting public opinion polls because as we know, the wildlife does belong to the people of Nevada, and 98% of the people are interested in the wildlife and wildlife watching and so forth. One of the things that we did bring up was doing polling, for example, on the public's opinion of hounding of bears or even hunting of bears. I know in this past year there was a survey done specifically for hunters, and I think it had to do with elk hunting at a cost of about $45,000. And I think something perhaps could be considered and put in the budget that has to do with public opinion of wildlife and management, as I mentioned, specifically with the bears. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Come on up, John.